You live.
Welcome to Slow News Day Live. My name is Steve Poikinen. I'm here in beautiful Boulder Creek, California, and thanks for hanging out for the second episode of the day. My guest doesn't really need an introduction unless you've been living, under a rock or some shit like that for the last at least couple of years. But she is one of the best, if not the best, investigative journalists that we have going for us in independent media. She has done some incredible work and has been gracious enough with her time to be on this little show for, I think this is interview number 6 or something like that. I don't know. But Whitney Webb, thank you for being here today. It's really good to see you.
Likewise, it's great to be back on. Thanks.
You have been just deservedly blowing up and have done a ridiculous amount of interviews as of late because Ghislaine Maxwell found herself on the wrong end of handcuffs. And it's always like my hope that I don't give you the same interview that you've been subjected to for the last couple of weeks now. So I'm hoping that based on the article that you have up on your Patreon, that we can go a little bit deeper, because I don't know if everybody that interviews you is a subscriber to your Patreon, although they should be.
All right, sure. So, well, actually, originally I was just going to do like a 1 or 2 part article about the Maxwell family, but now it's actually going to be 3 parts. I'm basically going to do my own series just on the Maxwells, but focusing mostly on Ghislaine's 2 sisters, Christine and Isabel. The first part is really about Robert Maxwell, though, and how Christine and Isabel, as well as Ghislaine, were both we're all kind of accessories in some way to a lot of his intelligence work, mainly in the sale of the Promise software in the 1980s, which is one of the main, I guess you could say, services, right, that Robert Maxwell provided to Israeli intelligence. But it's worth pointing out that even though the back door was done by Israeli intelligence, the CIA ended up putting their own backdoor into Promise, and allegedly a lot of the stuff that Israel took out through their backdoor they shared with some parts, allied parts, I guess you could say, of U.S. intelligence, right? So you see a lot of overlap between those 2 agencies and what was going on then. But basically, Promise is like a huge can of worms and is like a really complex scandal. But basically, the Promise of today, right, is called Palantir, and Palantir does a lot of the same stuff. But it's interesting that, Promise was sort of phased out by the late 90s, and Palantir didn't really start getting government contracts until 2012, 2013. So what existed in that gap? Well, it was a company that was co-founded by Christine Maxwell, right, and a guy that was actively part of the CIA at the time of its founding, and was also in charge of awarding contracts for the intelligence community's databases while he was, in charge of that company, right? So it's pretty wild. So that's going to be part 2. And then part 3 is about how Isabel did a lot of the same stuff, but was really involved in Silicon Valley, the Israel Unit 8200 tech symbiosis, and that's sort of linked to intelligence operations also, and things like that. So that's kind of like an overview of the series, but I don't know how deep I want to go into it until I actually have it out, right? So part 1 I'm going to be making public in probably a day or 2 once I finish part 2, right? Which will probably be tomorrow.
Okay. Well, I of course would like to get into as much of this as we possibly can. But it is absolutely amazing to me the tentacles that the Maxwell family has, and how far they've been able to reach, and just how overall encompassing this one family has been able to I don't know, sort of insert themselves into all of the creepiest shit that goes on in our world. It's fascinating. And you discussed Robert Maxwell a fair amount over the last year or so, but this is really the first introduction that we're getting to Ghislaine Maxwell's siblings. I can't think of another outlet or another journalist who's really discussing this, which is what gives your work so much fucking value. Let's see. Let's go to the article. And again, you guys, if we can, Josh, put up Whitney's Patreon. If you're not a Patreon subscriber of Whitney's, you really should be. And getting a well, early look at this material is awesome. This is going to come up on The Last American Vagabond, right?
Well, actually, I'm thinking. Well, I'm making my own site, right, that I've sort of had for a while. I'm partnering it with Ryan's stuff at Last American Vagabond, but I'm going to be putting the series out on there. But I'm still going to be working at Last American Vagabond and putting articles out there too, right? So, but I think this one's going to be up on my site that I'm, redesigning right now too. Got a lot of stuff going on. But
is that Unlimited Hangout?
Yeah. Sorry, I probably should have said the name right. But I'll be relaunching that in a couple of days with this whole series.
Kick ass.
I mean, it's a lot of material, right? My Epstein original Epstein series sort of developed this way too. Like I was like, it'll be 2 articles, and then it was like 4 massive articles, right? So I mean, this is going to be like 3 giant articles. So the first one's basically done. There's a couple things I'm actually going to go back and add that we can talk about getting into part 1. But yeah, whatever you want to bring up in part 1, I'm down to talk about.
All right. Well, let's start with because we covered a little bit of the Promise software, but let's kick around Ed+Meese for a moment. Could we do that? Because I know if people are who are watching the show right now are old enough or remember who Ed+Meese is or has done some research into Ed+Meese, but he plays a little bit of a role in the Promise software and what came after that. So let's talk about that sick son of a bitch for a moment.
Well, I'm not an expert in Ed+Meese's past, but he was definitely very deeply enmeshed in Ronald Reagan's entire rise to power, from governor to California, and especially when he was president. He was Attorney General, head of the Department of Justice under Ronald Reagan, and during the Reagan administration was considered to be Reagan's most trusted advisor. He's one of the original neocons, preceding the PNAC neocon generation. He was one of, he's like one of the granddaddy neocons, I guess you could say. He was part of this so-called parallel shadow government that was actually reported about by the Miami Herald in the 80s, that talked about all the continuity of government, how people like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who weren't even officially in the administration at the time, were doing these continuity of government exercises. That was essentially operating a shadow parallel government to the official U.S. government during this time, that involved people like Ed+Meese and Bill Casey of the CIA, along with, Cheney and Rumsfeld, who would, go on to use that same sort of continuity of government infrastructure after 9/11. And of course, a lot of that infrastructure is still around today, and they've been sort of, with the coronavirus thing, bringing up continuity of government more than once in mainstream media rags like Newsweek and stuff. So definitely pretty wild. But anyway, Ed+Meese is sort of, at the genesis of that in the 1980s. As far as the Promise software goes, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the scandal relates to Israeli intelligence. That's because a copy of the Promise software was obtained by this guy, this really famous Israeli spy named Rafi Eitan, right? And Rafi Eitan then, after he obtained that copy, it was taken to a dual citizen programmer in California who put a backdoor in it that gave Israeli intelligence access to any database where that software program, any device connected to any database where that software program was installed, right? But Rafi Eitan was only able to access Promise because of the Department of Justice that was led by Ed+Meese, who essentially orchestrated, the series of events that allowed Rafi Eitan, under an alias, to obtain a copy of that. It was in direct collusion with the higher ups at, the Meese-led Department of Justice.
Which brings us to Earl Brian, I suppose, or at least in terms of your article, it does. And can you,
Right.
kind of give us give us a little bit of a feel for who Earl Brian was, because I don't think that anyone who got themselves the nickname "the man who walked over the dead" should be completely ignored in this conversation.
Right. So Earl Brian is a guy that was sort of in Ed+Meese's orbit, you know, back in the day too, when Ronald Reagan was governor of California. When Ronald Reagan was governor of California, Earl Brian was put in charge of some healthcare initiatives, which is where he got that nickname, "the man who walks over the dead," related to how he handled healthcare initiatives when Ronald Reagan was governor. So that can give you sort of an insight into like how freaking sociopathic this dude was. But anyway, Earl Brian set up like a web of private companies that involved selling healthcare products and software and whatnot. After Ronald Reagan was no longer governor of California, Ursula Meese, Ed+Meese's wife, was a major investor in most, if not all, of those companies, right? So anyway, Earl Brian was also, at one point when Reagan was president, also an unofficial envoy for some Middle East stuff, right? But anyway, he was in Tehran in Iran trying to sell some sort of healthcare product, like you know, of his private companies, and that is when he first met Rafi Eitan, and they were discussing the Promise software. While Brian was trying to build this private business empire, he was closely following this company called Inslaw Inc., which was run by, well, still exists, right? Run by Bill and Nancy Hamilton. Bill Hamilton being a former NSA official who were the designers, the creators of the Promise software. And so Brian was following, you know, the evolution of this software, as was Meese, right, very closely. And Brian had, Inslaw was actually aware that he had, you know, wanted to profit off of that software, the sale of it in some way. So essentially what happens when he meets up with Rafi Eitan is that he's complaining about how the Department of Justice ended up leasing this software from Inslaw, and that he wasn't getting any of the profits out of it, despite, you know, his finanglings and attempts to do so previously. And this is where Rafi Eitan sort of appeals to, I guess you could say, Earl Brian's business senses, or rather corruption. And they sort of, you know, come up with this plan for, you know, the insertion of a backdoor or a trapdoor into the software, and that, you know, Earl Brian could be a vehicle for marketing. His private tech company called Hadron Inc. could be a vehicle for selling that bug software to companies around the world. And actually, after the backdoor was installed in Promise, Earl Brian's Hadron sold it to, I believe, Iraqi intelligence and Jordan's military intelligence, and some private companies. But he wasn't exactly the most, you know, convincing salesman, right? Because he's like very clearly, like, you know, because of that nickname we talked about earlier, he doesn't really seem like someone you'd, you know, used car salesman type vibe, right? So
doesn't
anyway,
sound like a personable guy.
No, no. So anyway, Rafi Eitan is basically, you know, decides to look for another salesman, right? And the guy he decides upon is Robert Maxwell, who ends up selling $500 million in, you know, like 1980s dollars of this software around the world. By comparison, the CIA, when they got around a few years later to trying to do the same thing, making their own backdoor, they sold like 90 million of their version of Bug Promise. Robert Maxwell did 500 million in sales. Well, that's estimated too, right? We don't know the full extent of everywhere it went, right? Because there were probably, like, you know, under the table deals and whatnot for some of it, but definitely.
And I mean, your research here is fucking phenomenal. But the Promise software that was used in the military dictatorship of Chile, and it was used to round up dissidents in Guatemala. And these are, I mean, both of those instances are examples of U.S.-led destabilization or coup campaign.
Oh, yeah. It was also sold to a lot of Eastern European dictators during the time, too, that Robert Maxwell had close business associations with, and they also used it for rounding up dissidents, because Promise at the time was considered a really revolutionary software. because you could analyze things across databases in a way that they couldn't, information sharing at the time wasn't capable of doing before Promise. But it also enabled tracking of essentially anything. And that includes cash flows. That can also, on the other extreme, be for people, right? So it was tracking activities of people, their known associates and things like that. So, it actually ended up getting quite a bit of use in Operation Condor in Latin America, basically being used to round up and disappear people that oppose the dictatorship.
So and this is like the precursor to what Palantir is doing with contact tracing software.
Right, sure. But Palantir has also been tracking people and setting this stuff up long before coronavirus. I mean, since Palantir has been around, they've had a label that you can apply to people that the software tracks. Because remember that Palantir, long before coronavirus, has been, the major, in terms of this software, marketing this type of software, the chief contractor to all of U.S. intelligence for years, really since like 2013, 2014, right? So Palantir has a label it can apply to people, right? And it's subversive. And that's, Palantir's been marketing that ever since they've been around, right?
I just got a super chat in, Rob Juno, thank you. The question is, does Whitney think we will see a constitutional rewrite in the next 10 years? This is like way off subject from what we're talking about, but he paid to ask the question, so I'm gonna ask the question.
Is this a constitutional rewrite for the U.S. or for
I would
Chile?
imagine.
Because it's actually a thing going on in like Chile right now. Like there's been a long-standing push to get rid of the constitution that's, was written during the Pinochet dictatorship, right? So, but in terms of a U.S. one, I mean.
But I think it pertains. I'm almost positive it pertains to the U.S.
Okay, well, I haven't heard that, come up yet. I mean, I honestly think it's more likely that instead of rewriting the Constitution, I mean, it would just be sort of like a superficial thing. I think it's more likely they'll just throw it out and be like, welcome your new technocratic overlords. I mean, that's how it seems to me.
No, I agree with that gruesome yet highly likely scenario.
I mean, the way things are playing out, man,
It's nuts, man. And and we're getting off subject here, and we'll circle back to it, I promise. This isn't purely because I did some mild DMT about a half an hour ago. I'm just kind of trying to keep up with the flow of the chat. I was reading an article that USA Today, of all places, reported on, and it was about preloaded syringes with a COVID vaccine that include RFID tracking chips.
Yeah, but their caveat was that may be true, but what's not true is there's no evidence of mandatory vaccines, right?
And then in the same article, it says, well, at the federal level, but individual state governors could have the authority to mandate vaccines.
Right. Or also, we've already had like some educational institutions, like I think the University of Tennessee was first, saying that any student attending in the fall has to get the vaccine as soon as it becomes available.
Yeah,
mandatory
enrollment. You have to have a flu shot and potentially this COVID vaccine, if it's ready, to go to school. Like that,
that's fascism. That's what that is.
I'm often struck with the thought that, like, at the height of the Stasi, they would look at what the U.S. is doing now and be like, "Fuck, I didn't know you could do that."
Hey, well, fun fact, I mean, they got the idea for concentration camps for what the U.S. government had previously done to Native Americans, right? So, I mean, we kind of gave them a lot of ideas, you know what I mean? And don't forget about, like Prescott Bush, George H.W. Bush's father, and those guys bankrolling the Nazis too, or Allen Dulles, the first director of the CIA, being super tight with, business elites that were supportive of the Nazis and top Nazi figures, Yeah,
it is. I was talking to my first guest today about how the U.S. is basically just this macabre extension of the Roman Empire. And and when you look at like the societies that have propped up that have helped usher us into this direction of techno-fascism, there's a lot of correlation between who really ruled ancient Rome and who really rules in the United States. But that's an entirely fucking different conversation.
Yeah.
And I want to get into.
Well, I can segue back to what we're talking about, right? So the main difference between now and what like Rome are like today, there's these crazy technological tools of control, right? That enable those overlords to do things that, you know, people back in previous times could only dreamed of, right? So all of that really starts to come about with what we were talking about previously, which is Promise, right? Which is basically, you know, totally revolutionized how intelligence agencies, not just in the US or in allied countries, but around the world, use technology, specifically surveillance, things like that, because, you know, it could track people, meaning it could surveil people, right? And could also map connections between people that were previously impossible before that software became widely utilized, right? So on the one hand, you have this being sold to like dictatorships or other governments around the world, and they were using it to track people, take out dissidents, also to hide their money better, to like money launder more successfully and things like that. But then you have, you know, Israeli intelligence and like whatever associated elements in US intelligence they were working with, having access and being able to watch in real time those governments do that stuff. So for example, in Guatemala, Robert Maxwell sells Promise to that military dictatorship, and then 2 days later, Guatemala's dictatorship rounds up 20,000 people who are then disappeared, right? And Israel knew before the victims' families even freaking knew that they'd been rounded up because of that back door, right? And allegedly Israel was like, well, Rafi 18 years later was like, well, we just wanted to see how far they would go. But at the same time, you have to remember that the US and Israel were both arming most of those countries in Latin America, right? Those dictatorships. So. Yeah,
I mean, really, it's, so I know you've been getting some shit.
I mean, it comes with, yeah, it comes with the territory, right? So.
But they're coming after you specifically because you're reporting on people who were key figures in the Israeli military intelligence and part of the, I guess, the Two Eyes access or information sharing network between our CIA and Israeli Mossad. And it's worth noting that there is a difference between Israeli military intelligence and Mossad.
Right.
But it's not Whitney Webb's fault that Robert Maxwell worked for Israeli military intelligence. It's not Whitney Webb's fault that he had, what, 7 children that all turned out to be like horrific fucking spooks in their own right?
Well, 5 of them.
Okay.
5. There's 2 that like had falling outs with their dad, right? One of them like moved to Argentina to get away from his dad, and the other one like, you know, dropped off the map when he died. So, but the other 5 have definitely been involved in some shady shit. Obviously, Ghislaine Maxwell is the best known of those. I would argue her sisters are just as spooky as she is, though. And the 2 brothers, Kevin and Ian, in my opinion, appear to have sort of taken over another part of what Robert Maxwell was doing, which is the shady financial crap of his business empire, because Robert Maxwell had like all these interlocking foundations and trusts and things like that. Like he would buy a company and then he would set up 2 different like financial vehicles with the same name to like move money around and make shit untraceable. And like it was just like this crazy web. And that's part of why when he died, people couldn't find all this missing money, right? Because, you know, it was called the Lost Maxwell Millions at the time. Like people didn't know where all this money had been hidden. But Kevin and Ian sure seem to have known where it ended up, and so did Ghislaine. Because actually right before Robert Maxwell died, he had sent her to New York to sort of get deeply enmeshed in the New York power base with Epstein, right? This was before Robert Maxwell even died. And part of what he had set up for her is that he had just bought the New York Daily News. He put her in charge of special projects for that newspaper. And he also made her this ready-made, as it's described, or tailor-made, as it's described in British press, company that was called Maxwell Corporate Gifts. And no one knows what that company was really doing, but she apparently had access to a lot of things through that. It's also worth pointing out that the first person in Robert Maxwell's office on the yacht he died off of, the Lady Ghislaine, was actually Ghislaine Maxwell. And she was witnessed by this British journalist going in there and then shredding all these documents. So she knew, straight up going in there, which documents needed to be shredded and which ones didn't, right? So she was definitely involved in that to a significant degree before this whole sexual blackmail thing even started, and that was in '91.
That's fucking fascinating. And it's Robert Maxwell's death or speculated murder was all because of this embezzled cash. Do I have that bit right?
Well, it's part of it. He was in really dire financial straits, I guess you could say, and he had creditors demanding their money back. A lot of those creditors, though, were Israeli or linked to Israeli intelligence in some way, because a lot, like, for example, the money he even got to buy several of these media groups, like the Daily Mirror group that he embezzled the pension fund of, that came from these, like, Mossad-backed funders, right, with the explicit purpose of using, like, the money in the pension funds of, like, that group to be taken out. They'd finance Mossad activity or Israeli intelligence activity in Europe, and then after the operation was over, whatever, it would go back in. But as those movements were happening, Robert Maxwell started taking some for himself, right? And so things ended up, like, not working out well, because also during this time he was also raking in a ton of cash through the sale of the Promise software, right? I mean, those were like every time he'd sell to a country, those were like multi-million dollar deals. You know, so he'd get a huge cut of that too. But somehow he was like, all this money was missing, right? So, you know, there was definitely more to it than just, you know, him just taking money out of the pension fund for himself. But also he started to get really erratic as his finances deteriorated. Like, he ended up hiring some psychic to tell him who Mossad should assassinate. And then he would go to the director of Mossad and be like, my psychic told me we should murder these guys. And the Mossad director was like, yeah, you know, and stuff like that. But he was, like, really starting to lose it, right? And then at some point, a lot of these creditors that he couldn't get off his back, where he was trying to pressure Mossad to use their connections with these funder guys, these financial guys, to get them off of his back. And they wouldn't do it, right? Because they didn't want to, like, ruffle feathers for whatever reason. They had their reasons for not doing things. Then at one point he was going to sell one of the Israeli companies he owned to try and get some of the money back quickly. That company, called Cytex Corporation, was headed by the son of Israel's prime minister at the time, the prime minister being Yitzhak Shamir, who's a crazy fucking dude that we can talk about later if you want. But anyway, basically, Robert Maxwell chewed out his son, who was CEO of this company, because the CEO was like, no, I don't want you to sell off my company and make me lay off, like, half of my workforce, right? And so Robert Maxwell fucking chews this guy out. And then, of course, he goes and tells Daddy. And Yitzhak Shamir, in addition to being prime minister, used to be head of arguably the most evil and awful Zionist paramilitary group predating the state of Israel, the Stern Gang. So he didn't give a fuck, right? And so he was just like, you know, allegedly, right, he and Mossad director and some rogue guys in Mossad made the decision, you know, maybe we should rethink Maxwell, at which point Maxwell starts to say things like, well, if you can't help me out like I'm demanding you help me out, I can't guarantee my silence about certain things, right? So basically threatening to expose shit, and then, yeah.
I mean, isn't that you vocalizing that you're happy to sign your own death warrant?
But, I mean, like I said, this guy was, like, starting to lose it a little bit, right? I mean, he was, like, being pretty unstable. I mean, why would you chew out the son of the prime minister? Choose another company to take out of your portfolio, right? Why would you hire some random psychic to tell the Mossad director how to do his job? You know, I mean, he clearly was like not all there when this was going on, you know?
So there was a whole thing in the 80s where very powerful movers and shakers had a personal psychic. Like Ronald fucking Reagan had a psychic.
Yeah, so did Nancy Reagan. She had like an astrologer.
Nancy,
and
that's
stuff.
right.
Yeah.
Fuck it. And like the idea that I don't know, because I don't want to delegitimize everyone who delves into that like area of work. I think there are actually some people out there that are attuned to whatever cosmic vibrations and can pull things out of them. But I don't think that like Shirley MacLaine is one of those people. I don't think that Marianne Williamson is one of those people. You know what I mean? Like the opportunity for fraud and grift in that particular profession is almost unlimited.
Hey, but I mean, if you look at U.S. politics and even like media in general today, we are in the golden age of grift. I mean, let's not kid ourselves.
You are absolutely right about that, man. You are. I want to get in before we get into the Israeli Prime Minister there. Let's kind of set the stage for exactly how the Maxwell family took over their father's businesses and what they've transformed them into.
All right. Well, really quick, in order to point out the significance of where that happened, because like I would argue that the main venture after that was called the McKinley Group, and it created the first search engine, or the first search engine. They claim that anyway, right? Magellan, right? Which we can get into in a second. And I think that's significant because during that period of time that it was, extant, right? Which was like basically it was technically founded in 1992, but didn't really launch until 1993. But it was basically active from then until it was sold off in 1996. That involved Christine and Isabel, who, as I said earlier, I'm going to be showing in my new series that they are super spooky, both of them. Then you have Ghislaine Maxwell, who at the time was already in that sexual blackmail operation, involved in blackmailing like the Clintons and stuff like that, going to like Clinton like donor functions and stuff like this, doing the already trafficking kids with Jeffrey Epstein for intelligence, right? While she's involved in this. And then you have Kevin Maxwell, who was number 2 in Robert Maxwell's business empire, his heir apparent, and vowed after his father's death to be Robert Maxwell reincorporated. Right. So these are the guys that you have running this company that gets sold off in 1996. But it gets the importance of that company doesn't really take on full significance until you chart out where Christine and Isabel specifically went after that company, and Ghislaine to a certain extent. But it was basically in, the tech spheres of dominating or having, major tentacles in the tech spheres of the U.S. and Silicon Valley, and then in Israel through Isabel. Right. But we can get to that a little more later. And that's why also it makes sense you have people like Ghislaine Maxwell getting super tight with Elon Musk, LinkedIn's Reid Hoffman, Epstein getting close to people like Mark Zuckerberg, and Google's Sergey Brin, right? And meeting at all these venture capital functions and rebranding as tech investors after Epstein's outed as a pedo and all of this stuff, right? And him investing with Peter Thiel and companies. I mean, you start to see the whole picture come together, but it all started with that Magellan stuff. And Christine and Isabel created this McKinley Group Magellan thing. They directly said that what they wanted to do was rebuild part of their father's empire, right? And basically talked about how this would be recreating part of his legacy. I mean, these are direct quotes like from them, right? This is what they said about it. So pretty interesting. But before that, the reason, part of the reason why I think that makes it like a more convincing case for Christine and Isabel being spooky, even in this period of time, was their involvement in one of their father's front companies that was directly involved in the sale of Promise, called Information on Demand, right? Which was involved. So we can go back to that a little bit if that's okay.
yeah, no, let's touch on that because it's also a very, very informative section of the article. So let's touch on that because for the people who aren't on your Patreon, they'll be able to read this, in a couple of days?
I'll probably put part 1 out either today or probably early tomorrow morning. And then I'll have part 2 on Christine up Monday or Tuesday for patrons, and then it'll come out like a day or 2 later for everyone else.
Okay. And information on demand plays into this how?
Okay, so the Promise software stuff really got rolling in like 1983 or thereabouts, a year before Robert Maxwell, when the whole plan by Rafi Eitan and Earl Brian had already taken shape. Purchases this company in Berkeley, California called Information on Demand that had been created by a former librarian named Sue Rudge, I think is how you say her last name. Anyway, in 1984, Sue Rudge and Information on Demand were investigated by the FBI as part of a foreign counterintelligence investigation that was eventually shut down by higher-ups, Ed+Meese, again, right? Right before that, though, another Maxwell company called Pergamon Information International Corporation, based in McLean, Virginia, sent a letter to Bill Casey asking him to buy Promise, and if they could have a sit-down meeting to discuss Promise and things like this, the sale of software. The only thing redacted in that document is the name of the executive vice president of whoever that was. But, you know, I have my suspicions that it may be one of the Maxwell children, but we can get into that later.
This is, you said 84 this happened? Or I'm trying to remember when Casey stepped down from the CIA.
I can't remember when, I'd have to look that up again, exactly when his, I think he stopped in like 1985 is when Casey stepped down.
So he's the active director of the CIA when Maxwell is taking this proposal to him?
Right, well, it was addressed to director of the CIA. It said, "Dear director of the CIA." It didn't say Bill Casey or anything like that. So it was to whoever was the director of the CIA at the time, but if I remember correctly, that should have been Bill Casey. So. God,
I mean, that's just the fucking stones on that guy. And for anybody watching right now who's not familiar with Bill Casey was a CIA director who gave the very infamous quote, "We will know our disinformation campaign is complete when everything the American public believes is false." He's that guy.
He was also into kids. That'll be in my book about Epstein as well, and also involved in a lot of other creepy stuff, Bill Casey. But anyway, also really good friends with Roy Cohn, who was had a sex trafficking operation tied to the CIA, Donald Trump's mentor. All these fun guys. Anyway, back to Information on Demand, right? So anyway, all this investigation stuff happens. Picks up again because Robert Maxwell successfully visits Sandia and Los Alamos National Laboratories, which are at the heart of the new U.S. nuclear weapons system, and pitches the sale of Promise to them, right? And so, the people that are in charge of seeing, oh, can we install this technology or buy this technology, because it's one of the most sensitive laboratories for national security purposes or whatever in the U.S. So they go and they ask the NSA something, and the NSA people return with some apparently disturbing information that, of course, is redacted in the FBI documents about all this stuff, right? So we don't know what the NSA said. And then, yeah. And so Sue Rudge is interviewed. They ask her specifically about a particular client of Information on Demand. That information is also redacted. We don't know who it was. But anyway, as I said earlier, that investigation gets shut down by FBI headquarters at the time, which of course answers to Ed+Meese, right? And after that, they successfully sell that. Robert Maxwell successfully sells that in 1984, at which point Sue Rudge was no longer president and CEO because Robert Maxwell lists himself as president and CEO of Information on Demand. But just a few months later, the new president and CEO of Information on Demand is Christine Maxwell. And then after Isabel divorces from her first husband, who's a real crazy dude that we can go into, named Dale Gerasi, I think is how you say his last name. Anyway, she ends up working for Information on Demand as well, which continues to sell Promise to Fortune 500 companies, right? So these two girls directly involved in Daddy's Promise software business. By the way, the whole sale of the Promise software to Los Alamos and Sandia is just totally insane. It gave Israel, which, for decades prior had been conducting extreme espionage against the United States to, beef up its nuclear weapons program, gets direct access into the heart of all U.S. nuclear weapons technology, development of new nuclear weapons technologies, and all of that. It's super treasonous. And even though Robert Maxwell was not a U.S. citizen, his daughters living and working in the U.S. still allowed to live and work there while they were involved with this company. But also, his whole sale of this was facilitated by a sitting senator, John Tower, who was head of the Senate Armed Services Committee, who basically Maxwell bought out for $200,000, to be his consultant and get him to, open doors to Los Alamos for him. And this is the guy that George H.W. Bush tried to make his Secretary of Defense, but the Senate wouldn't even confirm him. And so that's how Dick Cheney became Pentagon chief, right? But this is the guy that was literally like treasonous as hell, right? Is the guy that Bush Sr. wants to put in charge of the Pentagon in the early 90s. So that's wild. Also crazy, that same guy, John Tower, dies in this super suspicious plane crash right after Robert Maxwell dies in 1991.
Huh.
So.
Huh. Yeah.
Fancy that.
As monstrous as Dick Cheney is, from what I've been reading, Tower was arguably worse. And again, it's correct to point out, it's necessary to point out that HW or Poppy was trying to get him to be the Secretary of Defense because he's the same fucking pedophile scumbag, H.W. Bush, who put Bill Barr in charge of the Department of Justice.
Right.
As the leading the cleanup crew for Iran-Contra.
It's worth pointing out, too, that Robert Maxwell had courted George H.W. Bush back in the 70s and referred to him as one of his sources, right? When he was already an intelligence asset for Israel, Robert Maxwell was officially recruited by Israeli intelligence in 1961, but had, he used intelligence sources. That's what Robert Maxwell called them, these high rollers in different political circles, right? For the purpose of advancing his business and expanding his empire. And those were people like Margaret Thatcher, Henry Kissinger, and George Bush Sr. before they were, well, not Kissinger, right? But before Thatcher and Bush were in major positions of power, right? Also interesting, the guy that connected Robert Maxwell to John Tower for Promise, Henry Kissinger. Robert Maxwell went to Henry Kissinger first and was like, how do I sell the trapdoor software to the most sensitive U.S. national laboratories? And Henry Kissinger says, John Tower's your guy.
Wow.
Fuck Henry Kissinger, dude. There's plenty of reasons, but that guy still gets awards and stuff on DC.
I know.
He's met with Trump a bunch of times, Drain the Swamp. Oh my God, it's just wild.
I'm convinced that that Henry Kissinger is living proof of that whole adrenochrome conspiracy thing.
Yeah.
He gets more bloated and jowly and fucking evil.
He's like a giant blob of satanic Jello. That's Henry Kissinger. Yeah,
that's a fantastic description. I may title that episode "Gigantic Blob of Satanic Jello." I'm gonna write that down.
Right.
Real quick before we keep going in this vein, I did have a question from one of my favorite chat crew people, Sarah Wagner, who just wanted to know if the Maxwell sisters are American citizens.
I know they're UK citizens and French citizens. I believe they are. I believe Isabel is also US and Christine as well. Yeah, but I'm not sure. But they all have multiple passports. So even Ghislaine, she told Maria Farmer, she was like, "Look at my 5 passports." And Maria was like, "How do you have so many passports?" And she was like, "My father got all of these for me." Right? I have nationalities in 5 countries because of my father. Right?
How is that even a fucking thing?
It shouldn't be, but I mean, the dude was like a huge like operative. Well, it's also important to point out like he's a front for other stuff. Like all these things aren't the Maxwell's idea, right? Robert Maxwell was chosen to be the salesman of this shit, right? Later on, Christine becomes the salesman of the software that basically is the successor to Promise and the precursor to Palantir, right? Creating this company called Gilead that we can get into, when that article's out. And then, Isabel also gets involved in that kind of stuff too, being the head. She was chosen because she was already established in Silicon Valley to spearhead the entrance of this Israeli software firm into U.S. Silicon Valley tech companies. A lot of what I write about when it comes to Israeli tech is about Unit 8200, this official policy in 2012 to get Unit 8200 linked companies that are tied to Israeli military intelligence and mesh in Silicon Valley companies. That started with Isabel Maxwell, who had a personal friendship and relationship with Bill Gates going back to 1995. And it's crazy. Anyway, that'll be in the part 3. I don't want to give too much away. But anyway, a lot of those operations separately, were fronted first by these Maxwell twins, right? And then you have Ghislaine on the other side doing sexual blackmail stuff to advance, Zionist foreign policy with respect to the Middle East. Because if you look at a lot of the politicians Epstein was blackmailing or courting, people like Bill Richardson, George Mitchell, people like that, they were involved in Middle East peace negotiations between Israel and Palestine, right? And in terms of the politicians Epstein was trying to compromise, I mean, that is pretty much a consistent trait. And then you also see Isabel Maxwell's freaking son appointed to be head of the Middle East Affairs desk of the State Department under Hillary Clinton, right?
Like, I heard you say that earlier today on Galloway's show, and I fucking wrote it down because I wanted to ask you about that. And like I have no qualms with George Galloway. Like the only intelligent thing that he said to you in that interview was, "Golly, this whole thing looks like a giant intelligence operation."
Well, I mean, it is a large intelligence operation, but what's important to point out is that the Maxwells are just like faces put on these companies that the real people orchestrating the shit, right, are hiding behind.
Can we unmask those people? Have you been able to do that?
Well, I mean, it's, yeah, but they're like pretty much, I mean, it depends on what level of the power structure you want to talk about, right? So like the person that was really behind Christine Maxwell's company after they sell off Magellan and the McKinley Group is an active, high-ranking CIA official, right, that co-founds the company with her and stays chairman of the board the whole time while he's overseeing, what the whole U.S. intelligence community buys, for database software. Right?
And who's that?
Well, I don't want to give it away yet. It'll be out on Tuesday.
Well, okay then. How about make
but,
sure you come back on the show when you're ready to divulge that information.
Yeah, sure thing. But, with Isabel Maxwell, right, she got involved with the same son of Itzhak Shamir that Robert Maxwell had chewed out, right? She brought him in to the board of the company she was fronting for. She gave personal tours of Shimon Peres, the former prime minister of Israel, super close to Ehud Barak, Epstein pal, who allegedly introduced Ehud Barak to Epstein. Allegedly. I don't really think that story's true, though. But, she gave him personal tours of the U.S. She was put in charge of his Center for Peace, which isn't about advancing peace. It's about advancing Israeli business, specifically tech companies. This whole same thing we've been talking about. Then she's also put in charge of this venture capital network. She's chairman of the board, which also includes Tamar Pardo, former Mossad director. Right? So you have Isabel Maxwell just getting super involved in all of this shit. I mean, they are both and then you have Ghislaine Maxwell the whole time doing the sexual blackmail stuff. It's really wild. I mean, those 3 kids, definitely very involved. I think Kevin and Ian, who were the other Maxwell sons, were involved in financing a lot of this also, because you see overlaps between some of their major shareholders and Christine's company. Kevin was involved in the McKinley Group and Magellan, but stayed pretty off the radar on that, but was involved in setting it up and financing it. And these 2 guys, they there's press reports following up on them and their father's legacy and all this stuff, you know, in the years later, like in the late 90s and early 2000s, it like lists them of having like, you know, each one has like 30 companies and no one knows what they really do. And like, you know, a bunch of them are pump and dumps that like go bankrupt and they like are allowed to continue running companies that they like pump and dump and intentionally drive into the ground and stuff. And like, then they get involved in these super big like real estate deals and are able to stay under the radar and get involved like with all this crazy stuff. I mean, it's really wild. They're just a really crazy family, and I just find it really amazing that the siblings haven't gotten like more scrutiny. And I also think it's super interesting to point out, you know, Ghislaine Maxwell was in the U.S. this whole fucking time, right? Since Epstein was arrested last year. And, you know, they knew she was in New England because that report came out. Oh, she's staying at this mansion with her, like, boyfriend, this guy who was tied up with Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. His company is Cargo Metrics, her alleged boyfriend, right? And as soon as that story came out, that's when the In-N-Out Burger LA photo psyop, which was a fake picture, came out to make everyone think, oh, she's actually on the West Coast. And then was the first of all these stories making Ghislaine, you know, out like she's Carmen Sandiego. Oh, she's here, you know, where's Ghislaine?
That's
but
right.
The whole
there
time,
was a fucking hashtag.
Right, but the whole time she's in New England, right? So that psyop was set up to distract people from the fact she was actually in New England. What's crazy, though, is why everyone's still focusing on the LA picture. Christine Maxwell gets photographed right next to that dude's house, loading tons of freaking bags into an SUV. Why the heck is she there? You know, she claimed later, because there was these British reporters from the Telegraph that had like stayed in that area despite the LA thing, because a bunch of reporters left that area to go to LA when that like fake picture came out, right? But like these guys stayed, and they see Christine Maxwell, they take pictures, and she's like, oh, I've only been here for, you know, 2 days staying at this hotel. Christine currently lives in Dallas, right? Dallas, Texas. So she's in Massachusetts staying for a couple days. But why do you need 8 suitcases if you're going to stay in Massachusetts for 2 days? You know?
Because you don't at all.
Right.
Oh.
Right.
So the assumption there then, or the conclusion that is the one you logically draw, is that she was taking things to Ghislaine.
Taking things from Ghislaine.
Or from Ghislaine. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And the whole time, Ghislaine is in New Hampshire, and she was able to buy this place.
Yeah, under the name G-Max.
G-Max.
Yeah, and the FBI's like, well, she used a fake name, so we didn't know it was her. And it's freaking, like, it's so wild. How the FBI is like, oh, you know, we're just incompetent. Yeah, right, you know?
Look, that's not to say that there aren't, you know, hundreds of incompetent FBI agents.
Well, yeah.
But this is it's a pretty short walk to figuring out that Ghislaine Maxwell might be G-Max when you know that she was like 2 properties over or something like that.
Yeah, and well, let's remember too, though, Christine Maxwell's company that was like tied up with the CIA guy and whatever, they built the data warehouses for the FBI after 9/11. So they had like a backdoor, the Maxwell family, into like all the FBI's shit, basically. So I'm supposed to believe that the FBI just like couldn't find Ghislaine Maxwell when there's like a connection like that. I mean, please.
And this whole thing, the fake picture, and her sister being spotted. I mean, this is literally like within what, 3 or 4 days. And it's when I saw that picture, I was like, oh, that's fake as fuck. That's funny. They're photoshopping Ghislaine Maxwell in places. Now, I didn't realize that it was like an article. Like, I just saw it on Twitter, and I thought that people were photoshopping Ghislaine Maxwell in weird spots.
Yeah, well, it was leaked. It was leaked to the New York Post, right?
Because wanted sex trafficking madam with a fuck ton of money goes to In-N-Out and sits outside
reading a book on the life and death of CIA operatives right after Epstein is you know, whatever.
I mean, Yeah, so you look at that and you're like, oh, they're fucking with us, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what that was. I think it was deliberate. We're fucking with you, specifically because of the book, right? I mean,
and
that was just
like right after there was a Ghislaine sighting in like Cape Cod or some shit like that.
Yeah, it was right after she was found at this boyfriend's house that was, you know, she later buys the property, you know, 2 houses down or whatever.
Yeah, so they had
to distract people from it. Yeah, it was
had to get people off the East Coast in order to. That's just, it's so fucking dark. You'd said in an interview here a while ago that you felt like from the time you started writing the Epstein series through the Dark Winter series that it was all just different parts of the same giant story. And here's another element to that is just really underscoring that point. What's the overlap between Ghislaine's activities and her sister's activities?
Well, I think it's just the intelligence ties, right? I mean, Ghislaine was doing sexual blackmail. That's entirely different than what Christy and Isabel were doing, which more had to do with successors to the Promise software, right? Or, you know, in Isabel's case, this whole long-standing attempt to create what I call in a lot of my reports a binational security state, which basically is a fusion of Israel's national security state with the U.S. national security state. And efforts to do that really go back to the beginning of the CIA, when you have people like the first counter intel chief of the CIA, James Jesus Angleton, getting super cozy with Israeli intelligence, and basically, you know, the higher ups at the CIA, you know, under Angleton, a lot of them were essentially working hand in glove with Israeli intelligence, and, you know, vice versa to a significant degree. And you actually have a monument to Angleton in Tel Aviv, right, today. So, like, you know, that type of cooperation between the U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence has existed for a very long time, and so they're basically just making this more overt now. And, you know, it's been private companies that have been the vehicle for that to a significant degree, right? Okay.
I know you don't have that much time left, but I want to hear more about the crazy as fuck Israeli Prime Minister.
Oh, Itzhak Shamir.
Whose name I can't fucking remember right now.
Yeah, his name. Yeah, his name is Itzhak Shamir. He used to be head of the Stern Gang. Itzhak Shamir, when he was Prime Minister of Israel, used to talk about all the time how much he fucking hated the United States, and he blamed the United States for the Holocaust. And the reason he said that was because the U.S. did not agree to pioneer and support the transfer of European Jews to Palestine before World War II and the Holocaust and all of that. And so, ergo, it wasn't Hitler's fault for the Holocaust, it was FDR's fault. And so he talked about all the time how much he hates the U.S., right? And it's interesting that he's prime minister when you have this Promise software shit go down. You have Jonathan Pollard, the most damaging spy in U.S. history, right, being recruited by Israeli intelligence by Rafi Eitan, the same guy, right, that did that. And you have a bunch of other stuff going on, too, that began in the 1980s. And, of course, the Epstein op was set up then, planned out then, the sexual blackmail thing, essentially, by, you know, overseen by this prime minister who, like, freaking hates the United States, even though they're supposed to be our greatest ally. But anyway, let's talk about who Itzhak Shamir was before he was prime minister. He was leader of the Stern Gang. The Stern Gang was this paramilitary group that exists. It was an offshoot of Irgun, which is basically the paramilitary terrorist group that Likud came out of. The Likud party of today that Netanyahu represents came out of Irgun, right? But the Stern Gang was an even more radical offshoot of Irgun. Irgun wasn't crazy enough for them. By the way, Irgun was created by fanatics that worshipped essentially Mussolini and wanted to create like a Zionist Mussolini-esque state. That's what they wanted for Israel, right? So anyway, the Stern Gang is even crazier than them, and they basically tried to actively ally with Hitler during World War II and tried to, yeah, you can look this up.
They're called the Stern Gang or Leahy. They're really crazy. Out of all of the paramilitary groups in Israel, they, you know, a lot of the other ones refer to themselves as freedom fighters or whatever. Leahy referred to themselves as terrorists. They were like, yeah, we are terrorists. So what? You know, and they murdered people left and right. They assassinated a bunch of people. You know, they conducted massacres on villages. I mean, so did Irgun, right? But the Stern Gang was like a totally another level of crazy. And anyway, the guy that led that became prime minister of Israel in the 1980s. Wild.
Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around, like, what was the propaganda campaign like in order to get him elected prime minister? Because you just said that he ran a fucking terrorist organization that tried to ally with Hitler.
Yeah.
And worship Mussolini?
Well, in order to explain that, you have to understand that he was preceded by Menachem Begin, who was previously head of Irgun, as prime minister of Israel. And that whole period of time, you know, was, you know, the essential end of whatever left or labor Zionist, you know, movement had ever really existed in Israel, and was totally taken way far to the ethno-fascist side, which explains a lot of why Israel is the way it is today, because it's essentially been governed by people like that, by people like Itzhak Shamir and people like Menachem Begin and their successors ever since Menachem Begin became prime minister of Israel in the 70s, right? So the propaganda campaign, I mean, you know, it went on for a really long time to sort of push society over there. But you have to remember, too, that because it's those people, those type of ideologues, right, have been there and been in power so long, they're also the people that appoint, you know, the ministers of education in Israel, who create the curriculums, who educate, you know, Israelis that are growing up then about how to view Israel and the rest of the world, right? So that's why you have people like Naftali Bennett, who's currently Minister of Defense. Before he was Minister of Defense, he was Minister of Education and writing, you know, the curriculum for elementary school kids. And before he was appointed to that, he was famous for saying, yeah, I'm so proud of how many Arabs I killed, you know? So, I mean, it's kind of like a more complex, you know, issue, obviously, that I can't really explain fully the whole, like, political history of Israel in, like, 5 minutes, you know?
Sure. Sure.
No.
It's a little bit mind-boggling to wrap your head around that concept. So
yeah, but the whole like Hitler
appreciate
thing with the Stern Gang, it was all about trying to get Jews to Palestine and create the state of Israel at any cost, right? And they were like, we don't care what kind of government you have up there in Germany, you know, give us the people and do whatever you want. I mean, they were basically just like absolutists and like, you know, the ends justify the means type stuff, which is how they justified, you know, mass murder also, right?
Yeah. No, that's just fucking crazy. Well, I've kept you a little bit over time, so I'm gonna go ahead and wrap. But we'll put up your Patreon page one more time. And please tell everyone where they can find your work. Remember the name of your website, and thank you so much for coming back on the show. I fucking love these conversations, even if they break my brain.
All right. Well, you can follow me on Twitter _Whitney Webb. I don't have any other social media networks because I kind of hate social media and I want it to die. So sorry, but I'm not sorry. I also have a Patreon, as you mentioned. It's Whitney Webb MPN for when I used to be at Mint Press. I no longer am associated with Mint Press. It's been that way most of the year. I write a lot of my stuff recently has been at The Last American Vagabond. I'm going to be continuing to produce regular content there regularly. I'm also going to be setting up my own site, which you can still visit. It has a lot of my articles published elsewhere there, but I'll be relaunching it soon, unlimitedhangout.com. And I also have a podcast, but I don't, you know, I have a lot of writing to do, so I'm not super regular about it, but they're usually deep dives into my articles for people that don't like to read. So you can look for that as well.
I think Steve froze up. Hold on. Oh no. All right, well, we're going to wrap, folks. Thank you, Whitney.
Yeah, no problem.
Until next time.